This is a story about a dog, written by A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot. James Herriot was an English veterinary surgeon and writer. He was born on 3rd October 1916 in Sunderland, England. James Herriot was his pen name. Being a noted veterinary surgeon, he utilized his vast experiences in writing stories about animals. He wrote a series of books of stories about animals and their masters. James Herriot died on 23rd February 1995 at the age of 78. In this story, he has written about a dog whose name was Tricky and his mistress was Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog was hugely fat. His eyes were blood red and rheumy. Mrs. Pumphrey gave him malt, cod liver oil, and bowls of Horlicks. Still, had no energy. The doctor advised her to cut down on sweet things. Tricky left eating and kept vomiting. He was to be hospitalized. The doctor gave Tricky nothing to eat for first 2 days except water. On the third day, there was a sign of improvement. He started taking food properly, and the doctor didn't give him any medical treatment. Tricky used to run around and play with the other dogs cheerfully. Soon he recovered completely, and Mrs. Pumphrey continued inquiring about Tricky on phone. When she came to collect the dog, tears were shining in her eyes. She called this magical recovery a triumph of surgery. Is a fabulous rich lady and resourceful with a large number of servants and maids. She is passionately attached to her little pet dog, Tricky. She is much worried about Tricky's miserable condition. Tricky had become hugely fat and listless. She thinks Tricky to be suffering from malnutrition. So she starts giving Tricky malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks every night. The doctor knew that Tricky's only fault was his greed for food. He advises Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down from food and sweets for Tricky. For Mrs. Pumphrey, it was very difficult because she pampers Tricky like a spoiled child. Mrs. Pumphrey is impractical but very compassionate and caring. She and her staff arranges all comforts, beds, cushions and toys for Tricky. She constantly inquires about his health from Dr. Herriot. She gratefully thanks Dr. Herriot for saving Tricky's life and calls it a triumph of surgery. Let me tell you something about Tricky. Tricky is a small dog. The only fault of Tricky is his greed for food. Overfeeding of sweets, cakes, and chocolates make Tricky hugely fat and obese. He becomes rheumy and listless. His tongue lolls from his jaw. Doctor advised Mrs. Pumphrey to keep Tricky on a very strict diet and give him plenty of exercise. Tricky becomes a victim of overindulgence and overfeeding. Dr. Herriot's instructions are ignored. Tricky loses appetite and starts vomiting. Dr. Herriot suggests Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky be hospitalized under his observation for a fortnight. Tricky's recovery is amazingly rapid. He is not given food but plenty of water. After a few days, Tricky starts taking interest in his surroundings. He is transformed into a flexible and hard-muscled dog. Tricky shows his love for his mistress by jumping onto her lap when she comes to collect him. So, can you imagine that Mrs. Pumphrey used to pamper him a lot, and she thinks that she can express her love by giving him lot of food to eat. But what was the fault? What was Tricky's fault? He was foodie. He loved to eat whatever comes in front of him. Now the question is, how does the dog recovers and how why this chapter is known as a triumph of surgery. So students, when Dr. Heriot took Tricky to the hospital and put him on single, gave him no food but plenty of water to eat. So no, one day he saw Tricky was running with other dogs jumping and just making a friendly. Um, um, he can see that he made a friendly atmosphere. He was barking with others dog and enjoying their company. So Dr. Heriot informed Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was out of danger and was recovering rapidly. So Mrs. Pumphrey was excited to hear and the news and started bringing fresh eggs and build his strength. Still, she is thinking that he needs lot of things to eat. She sent wine and brandy and just to improve Tricky's condition. But one day Dr. Heriot phoned Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky has recovered and she could take him home. Within 2 weeks, Tricky had been transformed into a flexible and hard-muscled animal. So when he saw his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, he leaped and reached to her lap. मतलब he jumped and just he wanted to hug Mrs. Pumphrey because he was far away from Mrs. Pumphrey and he was also missing Mrs. Pumphrey. So when he saw her, he just jumped and sat in her lap. Mrs. Pumphrey thanked Dr. Heriot and her eyes were wet and lip trembled. Means she was very happy to see Tricky in a very good condition and just named Tricky's recovery a triumph of surgery.